Hi students, it's Mrs. T. This is another lecture in Unit 4 where we're looking at macro-scale social issues that affect our micro-scale daily lives. So we will be looking at macro-scale norms, macro-scale social facts, social institutions, such as in the last video when we looked at family and what family means from a sociological perspective. In this video, we're going to talk about marriage and how marriage is a social institution, how it's connected to the economy, and how it's also connected to the legal system, which are other social institutions that we also talked about the economy a whole lot when we were talking about the family. We talked about the legal system a little bit too. Well, right now we're going to talk about marriage. We might in this video get to cohabitation. I've got it written on the board here. Cohabitation is what your grandma would have called shacking up. But we're going to maybe not have time in this video to talk about it. It might be in another one because I want to try to keep this short. So let's talk about marriage for just a second. So in the video when we were talking about family as a social institution from a sociological perspective, I kept on pounding on the fact that we need a sociological definition of family in our class and not the definition that you might find on, say, dictionary.com or something. I've got that app on my phone, or I ask Siri sometimes, what does family mean? I don't know what she would say if I asked her that right now. I might hear her speak up behind me with the voice activation something. I don't yet because I haven't said those magic words. Hey Siri. But anyway, marriage is another one of those sociological words that I'm going to ask you right now to forget what you learned in the books that your kindergarten teacher read to you during story time. Forget what your preacher minister told you about what marriage is. Forget about The Little Mermaid and all of the other little, Disney movies that, talks about true love and living happily ever after. We cannot use those folkway definitions of marriage in our sociology class. We have to use a very, very general definition of marriage that applies to all societies around the world. So we have to write our sociological definition of marriage very specifically in order to keep every society, every place that you find marriage, which is almost every place in the world, every place that you find marriage, we have to make sure that our sociological definition applies to all of those examples of what each society says a marriage is from one place to the next. Remember, norms do not stay the same from one place to the next. And if we assume that the way we do things is the way others do things, we are dabbling in that ethnocentrism thing that we need to try to guard against. Okay, so let's look at what key points are necessary in a correct, a good, and effective sociological definition of marriage. Okay? First, for marriage to be marriage, it has to be socially acceptable in the society where we are talking about. For instance, social acceptability should ring some bells for you about norms in society, because when we first learned the word norms way back when, I don't know when that was, but when we first learned about the word norms, we said it was about the social expectations that apply across the board in a society. So in our society, the USA, in our society, marriage is a legal institution. It is a legal institution. And so we begin a good sociological definition of marriage by saying a marriage is a legal and/or socially accepted union. Now, some places around the world don't involve the legal system in marriage. Some places around the world only need social acceptability of the type of relationship that the individuals are engaged in, social recognition, social acceptance of that relationship as a marriage for it to be recognized as such. In the United States, we kind of need both. remember there are three different types of norms. Their laws are norms, mores, which has to do with morality, and also folkways, which just has to do with common everyday stuff. So in our society, the United States, we have the legal and social acceptability, right? Legal and social acceptability is what's important to us. So if there are some people who want to be married, you can't merely climb to the top of a tall hill, go out to West Little Rock and climb Pinnacle Mountain and scream to north, south, east, and west in unison, "I marry you," and then climb back down or roll back down the mountain in my case and tell people, "We just got married on the top of Pinnacle Mountain." That's not a marriage. You can call it a marriage. We have free speech, and so we're able to say, hey, this is a marriage, but that's not the socially accepted form that a marriage is required to take. We have a legal situation in the United States. Marriage is a legal contract. You have to jump through a whole lot of legal hoops in order to be married, and you have to get, how many licenses do you have to are involved? You have to get a marriage license. You have to find someone who has a separate license with the authority to actually officiate a marriage and sign off on your license. And usually you have to pay that person a fee or a donation, honorarium. There's a variety of different things that you can call it. You usually have to make a donation to the preacher or pay the justice of the peace a certain fee to sign off on your license. And then you have to take it. The license costs money to begin with. It's like $60-$80, something like that. Last I checked, it's been a long time. But so the marriage license costs you money. You have to pay the fee for the person who is licensed to actually officiate your wedding. They have to pay a fee to get that license to officiate. They have to sign your marriage contract. You have to take it to the court and register it after that and get a certain stamp. I think you have like 45 days or something. These kinds of legal aspects of marriage aren't the same from one state to the next. They vary slightly from one place to the next. But in general, in the United States as a whole, the marriage laws are pretty uniform. So if you get married in Mississippi and then move to Montana as a married couple, your marriage is recognized in Montana as valid. And there are legal aspects for why marriage must be valid in order to, legal and emotional reasons why. Not emotional. I meant to say economic. Scratch out emotional, say economic reasons why marriages are supposed to be legal. Because marriage is really an economic arrangement for the most part. Not like Cinderella or Sleeping Beauty or anything like that. It's really a legal arrangement that has much more to do with economics than affection. Let me just put it that way. Okay, so some places don't have a complex legal system like the United States. All you need is social acceptability in order for a relationship to be recognized as a relationship, as a marriage. But in the United States, you need legal and socially acceptable in order for something to technically be a marriage. Okay? Again, in the United States, we have a particular type of marriage called monogamy. Monogamy is a word that has morphed with its popular meaning in my lifetime. Monogamy now, I hear it used to refer to just sexual fidelity in a relationship, sexual you and your partner only with no additional partners. That's the way monogamy usually is used these days. But technically, the word monogamy refers to a marriage of two people and two people only. Until very recently in your lifetime in the United States, those two people were a man and a woman. And because legally the man and the woman part has changed in recent days, The social acceptability of same-sex marriage is not there yet. I say yet because we've still got a lot of socialization going on for young children. And just because you change the law and make something legally okay does not mean that folkways and mores change immediately. It takes several generations of socialization to go through before we can see things differently than grandma and grandpa did. Okay, so 2 or more people is another part that has to be in a good definition of marriage for it to fit sociological needs. Okay, so in our country, the monogamy part means 2 people and only 2 people. So one thing that we really have to fix as sociologists is we really have to fix this idea that only 2 people can be in a marriage. Now, I don't mean that we need to change our folkways, mores, and laws in the United States to allow multiple people to be married to each other at the same time. I am not saying that. I am saying because marriage has to be defined in a way that covers all the examples of it in the world that we can find, we as sociologists must think in a global way. We have to be aware that many, many, many places in the world have a socially acceptable marriage arrangement called polygamy. It's socially acceptable in many places in the world. In some places in the world, there's also, like the US, that has legal and social acceptability, like the 2 sides of marriage. It's legal and socially acceptable to be married in a polygamous relationship. Poly, meaning multiple, gamy, like in monogamy, meaning marriage. Okay? So we have to kind of readjust our thinking because we were reared in the United States. We went through our socialization process in the United States. So when we think of marriage, we might think, 2 people. Okay, well, you and me both, right? That's what our socialization process taught us. But we can't be ethnocentric about that. We have to back up and say, wait a minute. There are other folkways, mores, and laws in the world that have different standards that are not the same as ours. And that's okay. So we just have to remember to put that or more in there so that it's a good sociological definition. We're not finished yet, though. Every marriage, whether it's a legal and social acceptability, legal only, or only only socially accepted, whichever format the marriage takes, 2 people or more people, whatever format it takes, always marriage includes rights and obligations that the partners have to each other and often to their family members. Because even in the United States, when we have monogamy, just 2 people who are entered into a legal marriage at one time, those 2 people are never alone in that marriage. Those 2 people are never only obligated to each other. They are usually obligated to whatever kin was brought in by this side of the marriage, whatever kin was brought in by this side of the marriage, and whatever offspring that they produce. There's always going to be additional people in the marriage. Even if you and your spouse remain childless, your mama and your daddy on both sides are going to be in your marriage because of, just emotional kind of bonds that you have with your family, like we talked about in a previous lecture. So the rights and obligations of a marriage are extremely important. The rights and obligations are made legally binding or socially acceptably binding by the norms of the marriage in the country that you're talking about. Let me use India for an example. So in India, even though laws have changed in recent decades to outlaw dowries, a dowry is a sum of money. It's not necessarily paper money. It's a sum of valuable, intrinsically valuable things that a bride offers to the groom's family. The bride's father technically offers it to the groom's family, sort of as a thank you for taking her off of his hands. I am making that very, very simplified and very reductionist. That sounded That sounded unkind. It's not necessarily an unkind thing. It is the custom. It is the socially acceptable way the relationship of marriage starts or started before it became illegal in India. And so this amount of money or amount of valuable goods is supposed to be exchanged to the groom's family, and it's supposed to be kept and not sold, not used. It's supposed to be kept as kind of like a social security account for the bride, because the bride is being married to the groom with the obligation of producing children. So there's an obligation to produce sons in particular. Sons are vitally important for a woman to produce, not only for her value within the family unit, but also for, like I said, let me use the word Social Security again. There is no governmental process of Social Security in other countries necessarily. There are some similar cases, but not like our Social Security system. In some cases, it is the family's obligation through marriage, through the children that are produced in marriage, and the generations that come support the older generations that are still alive and with us. So those are the obligations. Oh, I forgot to put my phone on silent. We will just have to let the 1950s ring back there, okay? I've got my old-fashioned ringtone on there from the 1950s. So anyway, there are also rights associated with marriage. For instance, I got married well into my 30s. I already had a lot of stuff. You know, I wasn't just living in an apartment or in my father's basement. I already had like a car and a lot of furniture and a lot of kind of valuable stuff. I had a retirement account from my job that I had had for more than 15 years by that point. I had a lot of valuables when I got married, and so did he. And when I was single, those were my valuables and he had no right to them. But at the time that we bought the marriage license, the officiant signed the marriage license, we filed it with the state where we were living. At that moment, because of the community property laws that we have in most states, certainly in the Louisiana Territory states, we have that 50-50 Napoleonic kind of law that applies to marriage. The 50-50 property laws, when I bring that into the marriage and when he brought his into the marriage, it is ours now. Unless we had a legal arrangement separate from the marriage ahead of time, so that we had, like they call it, like a prenuptial agreement. A prenuptial agreement is a legal agreement that changes some of the inherent legal rights associated with marriage. One of the legal rights associated with marriage is the ability to make medical decisions for a spouse. Unfortunately, my spouse had a terrible accident once and he was unconscious and he needed medical attention right away. And there was no question at the hospital who would make those medical decisions. It was his spouse. It was me. So immediately they asked, the physicians were like, is there a wife here? Is there a next of kin? Well, wife is number one. I don't share his bloodline, but they used next of kin because marriage legally makes me his kin. Not bloodline kin, but legal kin. And so I trumped his children, I trumped his mama, I trumped everybody else. I don't mean to imply there was a fight. Nobody asked them. Nobody asked the kids, nobody asked the mama, because when the doctors were like, is the wife here? Yes, here she is, present. They asked me and gave no concern for anybody else. They listened to me. So there's the rights that we have, some of the rights that we have. We also have obligations. I have an obligation. Let's use an economic one. I have an obligation not to go to Oaklawn every chance I get and run up a debt that's so high that we're never going to dig out of it. I have an obligation to do that. I will be legally committing fraud in my marriage if I do that and I hide that debt from my husband because he's legally tied to me. Legally, excuse me. Pardon me. So there are obligations certainly on a daily basis within the household. We've talked about statuses and roles within the household, breadwinner and caregiver. Those are some kind of like the socially acceptable folkways, maybe mores part of daily life within a committed relationship, legal relationship that we call a marriage. But there are some macro level legal obligations and rights that go across the board that everybody enjoys if they've gone through that legal process called a marriage. Okay, if. And so some of you are probably thinking right now, and sometimes people do a reaction paper about what is the show? Sister Wives. That's the name of the show. There's a show called Sister Wives, and they got famous or whatever because it's supposed to be one man with, is it 4 wives? I don't remember. So in this country, you can call me mama if you want to. That doesn't make me legally or biologically your mama unless an adoption happens, right? So in the case of that particular polygamy example, that man has a legal marriage with the first lady. I don't remember her name, but she's the one with the one child. That one child has a legal right to her father's Social Security, to her father's retirement, to her father's goods. By default, has a legal right. The other people who he is, watch my air quotes, married to, sure, they had a ceremony, sure, they had a reception, sure, there was a dress, sure, there was a wedding night, sure, there was all this. But that is simply behavior that consenting adults can engage in. It is not something that in our society we legally accept as a marriage. As a matter of fact, they cannot get the marriage license I told you about. An officiant cannot sign on any kind of marriage license, and they cannot register it with the court because they don't have a divorce from the first one first, the first marriage first. Right? So marriage is a legal arrangement. There's obligations, there's rights, and those obligations extend not only in the micro scale everyday life, but in the legal realm too. And we haven't even gotten, I've used the word divorce, but we haven't even gotten to that yet. There's a lot to cover in this lecture. So I'll probably stop at the end of this, and then we'll talk about shacking up in the next lecture, divorce and shacking up. Cohabitation, sorry, I should use the sociological term, cohabitation, to live together. Okay, so marriage usually involves sexual activity, but not always. Okay, so usually a marriage has the assumption of sexual activity because especially if the partners are young of childbearing age. And when I say young of childbearing age, in some cultures it is socially acceptable to get married as soon as the female starts her menstrual cycle. So there's sexual activity involved in those marriages because reproduction is one of the obligations for that kind of union. So there's an assumption of sexual activity, but not always. So remember, I said that there's an economic function for marriage. In a lot of societies where arranged marriage is a norm, is a socially acceptable thing. Again, we are not accustomed to arranged marriage in our culture. So even though you're thinking about a show, what's the other one? Married at First Sight, is that the name of it? One of my former students texted me about it one time, was like, have you seen this show? There's so much sociology in it. There is. However, the marriages that the psychologists and sociologists match up and arrange never work because in our socialization process, did you grow up with the notion being taught that arranged marriages were okay, or did you grow up with the notion that you were supposed to choose them yourself? So our socialization process really ingrains ideas and behaviors in us. So we have to be careful about, thinking, oh, that means it's bad, or being ethnocentric about arranged marriages. Many cultures have arranged marriages, and those kids grow up in their socialization process knowing from the very beginning that arranged marriages are perfectly normal. That doesn't mean they're not scared. That doesn't mean they, maybe don't like some of the decisions that are made for them, but they accept it much more readily than you and I would, because we were reared, and in our socialization process, we were taught that it is individual choice. Or maybe even some of you have been taught that it is like God's ordination, that there's one special person for you. on earth, and only one. And so, anyway, those young people who get married, typically you have the assumption that there's sexual activity. But in other parts of the world where arranged marriages are the norm, it's not uncommon for you to see an older man who has lost his first wife maybe, or maybe even still has his first wife living, if polygamy is allowed, who marries a much younger, when I say much younger, I mean like 3-4 decades younger wife. And there isn't necessarily sexual activity with that wife. Instead, that wife was married, taken into the household, and given the economic benefit of the household in exchange for her caregiving function, for the caregiver function that typically still today is associated with wife and mother. So if you have an older or even elderly person who is ailing and maybe needs help with this and help with that and can't cook anymore or clean anymore, it's much cheaper to marry your maid, your cook, your physical therapist. It's much easier to marry one person who can serve all of those functions than to pay for those functions outside the household. Just like when we were talking about the breadwinner and caregiver functions in the household, the family. It's much cheaper to marry a spouse to do all those things than to pay even hourly wages or a salary to people to fill specific functions that you would have to do in the absence of that spouse. Okay, so forget that I have cohabitation written on the board here. We're not going to talk about that in this lecture because this is getting too long already. But this, above this line, all of these key points must be in a good sociological definition of the word marriage in order for it to apply to all of the cases in the world that we can observe, okay? Please notice there is no place in here that says anything about love, okay? Intentionally, love is left out of this because love is not a prerequisite for marriage. Love is really a Western kind of ideal. When I say Western culture, I'm talking about cultures that the origin of which is in Europe and was transplanted here in this country by Europeans. So love is not the socially accepted prerequisite for marriages all over the world. Instead, economics is much more commonly the consideration for marriage, whether you choose your marriage partner yourself or whether you come from a culture where arranged marriages are the norm. Economic reasons, benefits for both families are really the primary reasons why marriages take place. So, sorry, Walt Disney, your storylines are just really, that's why we call them fairy tales, right? They're just really wacko for the way that most of the world does things. So, okay, so this is about marriage. It's a social institution because it affects so many other social institutions. We'll talk about cohabitation and divorce in the next lecture. And cohabitation is not a social institution. As a matter of fact, there's no legal protection that roommates who are carrying on have for each other. Just watch a couple episodes of Judge Judy to see that. I don't know how many times she throws people out. I don't care whose credit card the washer and dryer were on. You're not married. And she'll even say, "Are you stupid or something?" Have you seen her do that? Anyway, gotta have my Judge Judy fix every now and then. But not on the days that I'm grading papers. Promise. Okay, so I will see you again in another video. And please text me with questions until then.